The death penalty seems brutal,
outdated,
atrocious,
archaic,
barbarian punishment.
I believe every state should have it.
A great idea.
2009, a Saudi Arabian court sentenced a gang leader to death by beheading, then ordered that his body and head be displayed in public for 3 days. A grim reminder that sometimes even death wasn't deemed as enough punishment. Here are 6 of the most brutal death row execution methods still active.
This execution protocol we have here, I'm going to get much more deep. You're strapped down to a table. You have to wear a diaper, and then they're going to jam needles until they find the vein.
It's April 29th, 2014, and it's Clayton Lockett's last day. Oklahoma was ready to carry out the lethal injection sentence, a process that should have taken just a few minutes. But 14 minutes in, Lockett was writhing on the table, his eyes wide open, groaning, and trying to sit up. He'd been injected with a cocktail of drugs meant to make him unconscious and stop his heart. But something had gone terribly wrong. What was supposed to be a humane death turned into a painful, chaotic experience that ended 43 minutes later, not from the drugs, but from a heart attack. Now, lethal injection wasn't always the default choice for capital punishment. You see, back in 1977, an Oklahoma medical examiner named Dr. J. Chapman suggested it as a supposedly gentler alternative to the electric chair or firing squad. He came up with a 3-drug combination: sodium thiopental to knock the person out, and coronium bromide to paralyze them, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. Now, after Chapman developed this formula, Texas had adopted it as a new method for capital punishment, becoming the first state to use it in 1982. This would mark a shift away from previous methods like electrocution, as lethal injection was now seen as a more humane alternative. Over time, lethal injection spread across the country and even internationally, with places like China and Vietnam adopting the method. On paper, it seemed like a quiet, controlled way to die. No flames, no gunshots, just a few syringes and a soft exit. But in cases like Lockett's, lethal injection isn't nearly as smooth as it sounds. Studies have found that it's far from painless. In fact, autopsies reveal that many inmates suffer from something called pulmonary edema during the process, where fluid fills up in the lungs, creating the sensation of drowning. Dr. Joel Zivit, an anesthesiologist from Emory University, stumbled upon this while reviewing autopsy reports for inmates. Now, he had noticed that lungs were heavier than they should have been, sometimes twice as heavy, swollen with fluid. That buildup means the person was gasping for air before they died, a terrifying experience, especially when the paralytic drug kicks in, freezing every muscle in place.
The only reason why lethal injection appears to be less cruel is because of how it appears. And it appears like that because of paralyzing drugs.
Now, you'd think the first drug, sodium thiopental, would be enough to block out all this suffering, but that's not always the case. Drug shortages have pushed states to use alternatives, like midazolam, which doesn't fully anesthetize. Midazolam might make you feel drowsy, but it's not powerful enough to erase pain. So if an inmate isn't completely under, they will definitely feel the potassium chloride burning through their veins, a feeling that's often described as fire from the inside out. And the problem is, once the paralytic is administered, they can't even move or scream. It's a silent, hidden agony, and that agony isn't rare. Back in July 23, 2014, the same year as Lockett's execution, Joseph Wood in Arizona took almost 2 hours to die, gasping and snorting over 600 times as witnesses watched on in horror. And back in 2006, Angel Diaz in Florida spent 34 minutes on the gurney, moving and grimacing after his IV was misplaced, causing the drugs to seep into his soft tissues instead of his veins. And these cases are just a few examples of a chilling reality. Lethal injection can be just as brutal as any other method, even if it looks okay from the outside. And today, debates over how humane lethal injection truly is are everywhere. In Ohio, a federal court even ruled that pulmonary edema could amount to cruel and unusual punishment, meeting the standard of the Eighth Amendment. While that decision was later overturned, Ohio's governor has put executions on hold, citing these disturbing findings and ongoing issues with drug supplies. And while lethal injection was surely meant to look peaceful, almost clinical, but peel back the curtain and it's clear that this isn't the gentle method it was promised to be. Yet some methods don't even try to hide the brutality, like when you're facing a hail of bullets.
He was wearing a navy blue jumpsuit. Didn't realize until later that the navy blue masked the blood that pooled.
It's May 16, 1879, in Utah Territory. Wallace Wilkerson sat in the jail yard, determined to face death on his own terms. He'd refused the blindfold and restraints, insisting he wanted to look at his executioners straight in the eyes. And so, with a cigar in one hand, he squared his shoulders and waited as the command came. Ready? Aim! Shots rang out, and Wilkerson lurched forward, screaming, "Oh my God, they've missed!" He wasn't wrong. The bullets tore into his arm and torso but missed his heart. It took him 27 agonizing minutes to die. An awful reminder of what can happen when a method built on precision goes terribly wrong. Depending on how good the shooters are, execution by firing squad is as brutal as it sounds. There's no quiet clinical setting, no attempt to soften the blow. The condemned face a row of gunmen with a simple target pinned over their hearts. They're usually blindfolded and restrained, standing or sitting, waiting for that final command. When it's given, the gunmen fire in unison, aiming to kill the prisoner in a matter of seconds. That's not always the case. Even the smallest misfire can mean a painful, drawn-out end. Firing squads have their roots in the military. Back then, they were used on soldiers found guilty of desertion, mutiny, or even espionage. It made sense. Rifles were readily available, and a bullet aimed at the heart was seen as a quick and effective way to kill someone. Now, some of those old traditions are still around today, like the blank round. In many firing squads, one shooter is given a blank cartridge or a rubber bullet, so none of the gunmen know for sure who fired that fatal shot. It's supposed to make it a bit easier for them, to make them feel like there's a chance they didn't take that final shot which ended someone's life. But even within these measures, firing squads are anything but gentle. And when things go wrong, the horror of this method is on full display. In his 2022 book, South African businessman Daniel Jans van Rensburg shared one of his most traumatizing experiences inside Equatorial Guinea's infamous Black Beach prison. One day, he had to watch as his friend and 6 others were marched up a hill to face a firing squad. But the squad was untrained, disorganized, and even drunk. Some of these guys needed multiple shots before they died, with soldiers firing over and over until each body was totally still. And even in the US, the firing squad has its share of botched cases. Take the case of Alicio Mares, who was executed in Utah in 1951. Like Wilkerson, Alicio suffered a painful, drawn-out death when 2 bullets missed his heart, striking his hip and abdomen instead. It took several long minutes before he was declared dead. These cases reveal the vulnerability of what might seem like a straightforward method, because when human aim is involved, it can get messy fast. Today, firing squads are still legal in places like North Korea, Indonesia, and parts of the US, though they are rarely used. But after more than a decade without it, Utah reintroduced it back in 2010 for the execution of Ronnie Lee Gardner, who was pronounced dead within 2 minutes. Gardner sat surrounded by sandbags with a target over his heart as 5 riflemen fired from 25 feet away. It was quick and, to some, a cleaner way to die.
What caught my attention was that it was so sudden, so quick. Boom, boom, just like that.
It was over pretty quickly. It was cleaner than I expected.
But for many, the sight of men lined up, rifles aimed, no anesthesia, and just that raw, terrible anticipation feels cruel and unusual. In fact, in a 2014 poll, only 12% of Americans at that time said they would support the method. But the firing squad ain't the only method that can go horribly wrong. Some depend on just a rope, a drop, and a thin hope that it all goes as planned.
Most criminals were executed by hanging. They would climb up a ladder or stand over a trapdoor and then be launched into eternity, as the newspapers put it.
We time travel back to February 21st, 1930. Eva Duggan stood on the gallows in Arizona, calm and composed. She even had the presence of mind to tell her guards, "Don't hold my arms so tight. The people will think I'm afraid." Moments later, the trapdoor opened and she fell. But instead of a quick, quiet death, Duggan's execution took a horrifying turn. The force of the fall was too strong, and her head was torn from her body, rolling to a stop at the feet of stunned witnesses, with some fainting on the spot. That death was so gruesome that Arizona moved away from hangings as its execution method soon afterward. Now, hanging is one of the oldest ways to carry out an execution. It's straightforward, a noose, a drop, and the weight of the body doing the rest. But there's more to it than you might think. For it to be effective, meaning that it breaks the neck and causes an instant death, the drop has to be calculated precisely based on the person's height and weight. Get it wrong, and the results are either unbearably slow or horrifically messy. Too long a drop, and decapitation is a real risk. Too short, and the condemned person might strangle for minutes, enduring one of the slowest, most painful deaths imaginable. Different countries have used and still use various forms of hanging, with each method carrying its own grim reputation. Take the short drop, for example, which was common before the 1850s and still practiced in places like Iran and Afghanistan. The condemned is left dangling as their weight gradually tightens the noose, leading to death by slow strangulation. It's a painful process, with consciousness fading only gradually. The method requires almost no specialized equipment, which is partly why it's being so widely used in cases where speed and precision aren't the main priorities. Then we have the long drop, developed by Britain in the 19th century to be a more humane version of hanging. Now, the idea was to make the fall long enough to break the neck instantly, ensuring a faster death. Countries like Singapore and Japan still use this method. But even though it may be a quicker way to do it, there's still a heavy psychological toll on death row inmates in a place like Japan, where prisoners don't know the day of their execution until just hours before it happens. Just imagine waiting, filled with constant dread. That's its own kind of torture. And when the time finally comes, they're blindfolded, led to the gallows, and positioned over the trapdoor. Then several officers each press a button, but only one triggers the drop. So none of them know who actually delivered the final blow. It is a small detail, but one that lets each officer sleep better at night. Yet even with the most careful planning, hangings can and do go wrong. 1901, Tom Blackjack Ketchum, a famous outlaw, faced a similar fate to Eva Duggan's. After spending time in prison, he'd gain weight, but no one really took that into account before his hanging. And so the impact of the drop was so forceful that it decapitated him. A more recent case was Barzan Ibrahim al-Tikriti, Saddam Hussein's half-brother, who was hanged in 2007. The executioner miscalculated the drop, and al-Tikriti was also beheaded. That led to an international spectacle, and the footage left viewers horrified by the brutal result. And so, despite the long history and supposed precision of this method, these cases remind us that even with hanging, even the smallest mistake can lead to disastrous outcomes. But now, what happens when the process feels more like a science experiment, as it does in the gas chamber?
I stood there and cried while I saw someone get suffocated to death.
Let's go to September 2nd, 1983. Inside Mississippi State Penitentiary, we have Jimmy Lee Gray strapped into the gas chamber, instructed to breathe deeply as cyanide pellets are dropped into a vat of acid beneath him. Now, his death was supposed to be quick, but without a headrest, Gray began thrashing, his head banging against the iron pole behind him. Witnesses watched as he gasped, each breath more desperate than the last, until finally, after nearly 8 minutes, he went silent. Later, his attorney condemned the whole scene, saying, Jimmy Lee Gray died banging his head against a steel pole in the gas chamber while reporters counted his moans. 1924, Nevada introduces the gas chamber, marketed as a humane alternative to hanging or electrocution. Now, originally they wanted to pump cyanide gas into an inmate's cell while he slept, but when that plan failed due to gas leaks, Nevada built a sealed chamber just for executions. So they tell the prisoners to breathe deeply to speed up unconsciousness while they're strapped into a chair, and then cyanide pellets are dropped into a vat of sulfuric acid below them, which then releases the lethal gas. And then what was supposed to be a painless death often turned into something much worse. Former San Quentin warden Clifton Duffy described it as evidence of extreme horror, pain, and strangling. Witnesses reported prisoners thrashing and gasping, turning purple, their eyes bulging and froth forming around their mouths. What's more, the body's natural reactions, convulsions, urination, and defecation were impossible to hide. And after each execution, the chamber had to be purged of toxic air and the body carefully removed, with staff even patting down the inmate's hair to release trapped gas. Then the history of the chambers took an even darker turn with Nazi Germany. During the Holocaust, gas chambers became an industrialized method of mass murder. Starting in 1939, these Nazis used them for euthanasia killings, as they called it, targeting people with disabilities. Soon they were scaled up in concentration camps, where hydrogen cyanide was used to kill thousands per day. Camps like Auschwitz and Majdanek became grim symbols of mass murder, forever linking gas chambers to some of history's darkest atrocities. And in the US, reports of botched gas chamber executions continue to pile up in the 80s and 90s. 1992, in Arizona, Donald Harding took 11 agonizing minutes to die fighting for breath. Witnesses were so traumatized that they were reported to have insomnia for weeks. The execution was so horrific that the warden vowed he'd resign if ever asked to oversee another execution using the gas chamber. Later that same year in California, Robert Alton Harris's execution drove the point home. Harris convulsed violently, his face turning red as veins bulged in his neck. Prison officials even tried to stop the process to prevent further suffering, but it was too late. His death even pushed California to declare the gas chamber a violation of the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Despite cases like these, though, the gas chamber remains technically legal in a few states as a backup to lethal injection. Wyoming, Missouri, California, and Arizona haven't entirely abolished it, though it's rarely, if ever, used today. By the late 1990s, only one more prisoner would die this way. Walter LeGrand, who was executed in Arizona in 1999, took 18 long minutes to die. His body twitching, his face flushing as the gas filled the chamber. However, in a surprising turn, Alabama has recently tried a different gas-based method, nitrogen hypoxia, to execute Kenneth Eugene Smith, stirring up new outrage and questions about whether any gas method can truly be humane. On January 25, 2024, Smith was strapped in and fitted with a mask pumping pure nitrogen, meant to suffocate him without pain by cutting off oxygen. Officials had claimed it would be a painless way to die, but witnesses saw something far from peaceful. Smith shook, convulsed, and gasped for air, visibly struggling in his restraints. This man suffered for 22 minutes before he was pronounced dead, proving that even with new techniques, the hope of a painless gas-based death remains as elusive as ever.
As witnesses watched 2 jolts of electricity flow through convicted killer Lee Hall.
You could see the wisp of steam or smoke, whatever it was, coming off the side of his head.
We go to May 3rd, 1946. Inside Louisiana State Penitentiary, there's Willie Francis, strapped into an electric chair, expecting his life to end with the flip of a switch. But when that current surged through his body, it didn't deliver the instant death he'd been told to expect. Instead, Willie's body convulsed as he screamed, "Take it off, let me breathe." His execution had gone horribly wrong. The prison's portable electric chair had been set up incorrectly by a drunk guard. Willie, still alive, was unstrapped and sent back to his cell, sparking a wave of national debate over the electric chair's humane image. When the chair was first proposed as a better alternative to hanging, it was sold as a more scientific way to carry out a death sentence. Back in 1881, Alfred P. Southwick, a dentist with a technical background, came up with the idea after hearing how a man had died almost instantly from an accidental electric shock. His design for the electric chair aimed to deliver a powerful shock to stop the heart, with electrodes placed on the head and leg. To Southwick, it seemed like a way to bring a quick, clean end to a condemned prisoner's life. By 1890, New York had adopted this method, and the electric chair became an official method of execution. But the first try wouldn't go as smoothly as expected. William Kemmler, the chair's first victim, needed 2 shocks to die, with the second current leaving his body visibly scorched. Despite this, the electric chair quickly became the official method of execution in the U.S., spreading across states and even overseas, as in the Philippines, where it became the primary means of execution until the country abolished the death penalty. So over time, states refined this procedure, developing protocols and setting high-voltage currents in an attempt to ensure a quick death. Here's how it was supposed to work. The inmate's head and legs are shaved, and they're seated in the chair, arms and legs strapped in with leather belts. A cap with a saltwater-soaked sponge is placed over the head. Electrodes are attached to the legs, and sometimes they add a hood or a blindfold. Once secured, a series of high-voltage cycles begins. The first powerful jolt, around 2,000 to 2,500 volts, is meant to knock them unconscious instantly and trigger cardiac arrest. Then a second lower jolt between 500 and 1,500 follows, targeting the organs to ensure death. After the cycles, a doctor checks for any remaining signs of life. If there are none, the time of death is recorded, and the body is left to cool down before removal. If there are signs of life, however, the doctor signals the warden, who usually orders another round of current. In theory, it was a straightforward process, but in practice, that chair often delivered a gruesome, drawn-out death instead of a humane end like it was supposed to offer. And despite of how brutal that chair can be, it soon found its way into American folklore. Nicknamed Old Sparky or Old Smoky in many states, it became infamous, taking on almost legendary status in pop culture and media. Alabama even painted its chair a bright yellow, earning the nickname Yellow Mama. But if these chairs really symbolized anything, it was a dark side of American justice. Powerful, brutal, and often unpredictable. By the late 20th century, however, horror stories of botched executions couldn't be ignored anymore. 1990, Jesse Tafero's execution in Florida takes a terrifying turn when flames erupted from his face and head. The horrifying scene was blamed on prison officials replacing Florida's old natural sea sponge with a kitchen sponge in that helmet-like headpiece, and his execution would take 3 jolts of electricity over several minutes. 7 years later, in 1997, the electric chair failed yet again in Florida when Pedro Medina's head burst into flames, leaving witnesses horrified. These incidents left a lasting stain on the electric chair's reputation. While Southwick had initially imagined it as a quick, humane alternative, the reality was often graphic and disturbing. Bodies would visibly convulse, heads and legs would bleed, and the smell of burning flesh would fill the room. Even prison staff who had witnessed many executions were always disturbed by what they saw. So it is no wonder that by the late 1990s, many states had turned to lethal injection, which at the time was seen as a quieter, more reliable alternative. But the electric chair didn't entirely disappear. A few states kept it as an option. Alabama, Tennessee, and South Carolina still allow inmates to choose the chair if they prefer it. In fact, the last execution by the chair in the U.S. took place on February 20th, 2020 in Tennessee, when Nicholas Todd Sutton was executed for a 1985 murder. And in 2024, Louisiana brought back their chair, reintroducing the option alongside nitrogen gas due to lethal injection drug shortages. And well, if the chair was meant to be quick but rarely lived up to that promise, beheading is supposed to be faster, though it's never clean. And just one slip-up can turn it into an agonizing nightmare.
Saudi Arabia's government carried out the beheadings of 37 people today. One of the bodies and the severed head were put on public display as a warning.
We take you to February 8th, 1587. Mary, Queen of Scots, stood in the cold chamber of Fotheringay Castle, dressed in crimson red, the color of martyrdom. She faced her death with dignity, but what should have been a quick, clean execution turned into a grim ordeal. The executioner's first swing missed her neck, gruesomely hitting the back of her head instantly. Mary gasped, but didn't fall. It took 3 blows to finally sever her head, turning her final moments into a gruesome and torturous end. Now, for centuries, beheading was thought to be the most humane execution method, meant to bring a quick end with a single strike. In ancient Greece and Rome, it was even reserved for the nobles, seen as an honorable way to die. But Mary's botched execution showed how easily things could go wrong. A dull blade, a shaky hand, or even one missed mark could make those final seconds horrifying. By the late 18th century, during the French Revolution, Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine proposed a device to put an end to such botched executions, a machine that could ensure a quick, consistent death. And so, the guillotine's sharp blade and precise drop were meant to make death instant. And in France, it soon became a great equalizer. Noble or commoner, everyone faced the same blade. But even the guillotine had its controversies. Rumors spread that after the blade fell, the condemned's eyelids would sometimes blink, or their lips would twitch, leading many to wonder if consciousness might still linger, if only for a few seconds after the actual beheading. And now it may be surprising to realize that even today, beheading is still practiced. In Saudi Arabia, it remains not just a method of execution, but a public event. Executions are scheduled in town squares, usually around 9 a.m., with crowds gathered to witness. The condemned is then escorted in, often blindfolded, to kneel before the crowd. A police official announces the crimes, before the executioner steps forward to deliver the final blow. In some cases, with severe crimes like rape or child molestation, result in the crucifixion of the beheaded body, where the remains are publicly displayed as a warning. 2009, in one instance, a Saudi Arabian court sentenced a gang leader not only to a beheading, but also to 3 days of public display after his execution. By 2024, Saudi Arabia had already reached a staggering milestone, with more than 200 people beheaded by October. These weren't just violent criminals, though. Many were political dissidents, activists, or even foreign nationals convicted of drug offenses. One notable case was Abdul Majid al-Nimr, a retired traffic officer initially accused of terrorism. Officials claimed that he had ties to al-Qaeda, but the court records told a different story. His actual offense was participating in an anti-government protest in Saudi Arabia's Shia-majority Eastern Province, and voicing his opinions in a WhatsApp group. Now, unfortunately, al-Nimir's case wouldn't be unique. Most of those executed for terrorism are from marginalized communities and foreign nationals, who often face trials with little to no legal representation. Human rights organizations have repeatedly condemned the conditions surrounding these executions, claiming that many confessions are obtained through torture or coercion, and that defendants rarely have access to legal aid. Amnesty International reported that this year alone, 38 foreign nationals were sentenced to death for drug-related crimes, with most lacking resources or connections to defend themselves. But despite all this, supporters still argue that beheading, if done right, is quick and merciful. Yet the brutality and the public spectacle tell a different story. Witnesses report the emotional toll of these events, both on the condemned and those forced to watch. And if the executioner falters, or if something goes wrong, the horror multiplies, leaving a lasting trauma for everyone involved.